So my name's Liam Olds. I'm Conservation Officer for the charity Buglife. I'm going to talk to you today about colliery spoil tips, which is an area of interest, or you could say obsession of mine. It's an area that I've been studying for about 5 years professionally, looking at the invertebrates associated with these sites. And I'm just going to kind of go through the value of these sites, why they're important, and a few other things as well. So the plan for today really is to introduce you to the term colliery spoil. It's something that you might not be familiar with. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brief history of coal mining in South Wales, which is my area that I'm studying. And look at sort of some of the reasons why these colliery sites are particularly interesting in terms of their biodiversity. We'll have a look at some of the habitats that are present on these sites. Particular focus on the invertebrates that are used in these sites, but also touching on some of the other wildlife groups as well. And then we'll have a look at the threats facing these sites and why we should be conserving them. And then I'll just direct you to a few other places should you want a little bit more information. So let's get started. So colliery spoil is essentially just waste material that's been left over from coal extraction. So as you'll know, many regions of the British Isles have a long history of coal mining. So particularly here in South Wales, but also places like Yorkshire and the central belt of Scotland and so forth. So as they went down underground to try to extract the coal, there was a lot of other waste material that needed removal, I suppose, and get out of the way during that process. So a lot of this waste material is essentially waste rock, was tipped up on the valley sides and the valley tops. And as you can see in this profile here, you can see that these colliery tips are basically just pure rock, very little organic matter, and they're composed largely of sedimentary rocks like shale and ironstone, but also fragments of coal, and it can be quite large fragments or quite fine material depending on how efficient they were at that period of time in extracting the coal. And then you have varying sort of materials as well, things like demolished buildings, so like concrete from old colliery sites, and other waste material as well. So there's a little bit of everything kind of thrown in together. And this colliery spoil is very nutrient poor, which is what makes it really valuable to wildlife, because it really slows down the rates of succession. So it takes a long time for habitats to develop on these sites. So they remain in quite good condition for long periods. So just a little bit of brief history regarding South Wales in particular, but also other places. So during the 19th and 20th century, obviously many regions of Britain were heavily reliant on coal mining. And during the Industrial Revolution, there was a huge demand for coal, basically to power or produce the steam power upon which industry depended. So this brought about a boom in the coal mining industry. And in South Wales alone, the industry employs some 232,000 men, women and children in 620 coal mines across South Wales. So it was a massive employer, and it would have been in other coal fields across Britain as well. And as you can imagine, with all that employment opportunities, it brought in a huge amount of people from all across Britain and further afield as well. So coming into the South Wales coalfield, you had people from rural parts of Wales, places like Ceredigion and further west. You had people from England, particularly the southwest of England, so Somerset and Cornwall and around that area. You had people from Ireland, from Scotland, and also from Europe then, so places like France, Italy, Spain, Russia, Poland, and so forth. And between the period 1851 and 1911, an estimated 366,000 people moved into South Wales coalfields, so it was a massive influx of people into what was previously a very rural and unpopulated area. And interestingly, during this period, South Wales absorbed immigrants at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world other than the United States. So as you can imagine, all those people coming in, all that infrastructure, all that housing, brought about very drastic changes to the environment. And this is an OS map of the Rhondda valleys, which are probably the most famous of the coal mining valleys in South Wales. So you've got the Rhondda Fawr, which is the larger Rhondda Valley running up on the left, and the Rhondda Fach, which is the smaller of the valleys running up on the right. And as you can see in this period, about 1874, 1875, is still a very rural region. You can see a little bit of terrace housing on the left there around Llwyno'r and Tonopandi, so the start of the coal mining industry really getting going in these valleys. And around 1851, the population of the Rhondda valleys was just under 2,000. But if you look very carefully, I want you to kind of focus really on where my pointer is here, these bands of what would be deciduous oak woodland that is extending up the Rhondda Fach here. You can see very well connected. And if you jump forward to around the time of the Second World War, you can see that woodland is almost completely gone. And you've got this massive expansion in the amount of terrace housing to support the coal miners. And you can also see the telltale signs of the coal tips. You've got these tram roads, and my pointer's going up now, heading up to spoil tips. You've got another tram road heading up here with another big spoil tip. So the coal industry was obviously really well underway during this period. So the population in around 1851 had gone from 2,000 in the Rhondda valleys up to 152,000. So you can really see that devastating impact, and coal mining has had really detrimental impact on wildlife with the destruction of our woodlands, but also with the pollutants in the rivers and so forth. But one of those sort of icons really of that destruction has been the spoil tips, which have become a legacy of the coal mining industry. Ironically, now they're really important, so they're almost a positive spin on quite a destructive industry. And these spoil tips are discarded on the valley tops and the valley sides, and they're quite dramatic. A lot of them are quite like these amazing tips in Caerphilly. So you've got the three pyramids, Glambrada, the three ones at the front, and then this other crazy one behind as well. But these are the real focus really of my talk, and how valuable these particular tips have become. And what makes them really interesting in terms of the biodiversity is they're very diverse. So they're very varied in their topography, as you could see on those previous images. So they're very up, down, all over the place. So of course the coal miners weren't doing everything all neat and tidy. Nothing was all level. So it's very much tipped as and when, really. So you get these varying different aspects. You get north, south, east and west, and everything in between. You get all these varying gradients. So you get very steep gradients. You can get quite flat bits of ground, shallow gradients and so forth. All of these interact, and you get varying hydrology. So in areas where the spoil is very compacted, you get waterlogged conditions. Where it's free draining, and you get very dry conditions. The spoil itself can vary quite a lot, both on sites and between sites. So as you can imagine, these spoil tips were formed over several decades, and they might have been going through different rocks at different periods of time. They would have been better at extracting coal later on as techniques got more efficient. So the spoil can actually vary across the site as well. It can be quite fine in some places and quite coarse in other places. And you get this varying pH as well. So everything from quite acidic conditions all the way through to very calcareous, and varying levels of disturbance as well. So some sites have been very much left alone. Others might have had quite a lot of off-road motorcyclists and other things. So all of these factors combined, and it results in these really complex habitat mosaics. So it means that a single colliery spoil tip that on the face of it might look like just one single habitat can actually support a wide variety of habitats, perhaps 8, 10 different habitats, all within really close proximity. And this is really important for invertebrates in particular, because many require 2 or more habitats to complete their life cycle. But as I'll mention later, they're also important for other groups as well. So over quite a short period of time, those that have been fortunate to survive and haven't been removed have undergone these pretty incredible transformations. So they've gone from these real black eyesores in the landscape, perhaps in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then just in a couple of decades, they've transformed into these really beautiful, spectacular wildlife havens. And these are just a couple of examples in the Rhondda valleys of some of these really important wildlife sites. And some of the habitats you get on these sites, you get very flower-rich conditions. So the fact that the actual coal spoil is very low in nutrients means that this stops these competitive plant species like grasses from outcompeting other plants. So it means that it gives wildflowers a chance to flourish. So you get very, very abundant wildflower-rich grasslands. As you can see in this picture here, this is the yellow plant is kidney vetch, and you get large expanses of this. And the fact that the ground is so nutrient poor, and it's so it's very nutrient poor, it means that you get these stressed ground conditions that basically it means that the plants, because they're stressed, they produce more flowers. So in fact, you get extra flowers, if that makes sense. You get these incredible displays. And if you can imagine how important flower-rich grasslands are at the moment, we've lost 90% of our wildflower-rich grasslands in the UK since 1940. So these coal tips are now among the most flower-rich habitats within South Wales coalfields. So they're really important. And we also got some other very flower-rich grasslands. So this is a very different sort of grassland, but actually just a couple of meters away from the previous photo. At a different time of year, you've got a lot of umbellifers, so a lot of ragwort, which is a really important plant that supports 44 invertebrate species on its own, and it's important for a lot of others. But also things like pignut, which is a white plant there, and lots of other things like wild carrot and so forth. Get a lot of legume-rich grasslands, so grasslands that are very rich in things like white clover, red clover, and birds of trefoil. As you can see, some of the red clover and white clover in this grassland here. We get a lot of common birds of trefoil, which is yellow plant, as you can see here, and large expanses of it here at Mardy Colliery. And this tends to be a very abundant plant on coal tips. It's one of these nitrogen fixers, the ones that put nitrogen into the soil. But a really important plant, and probably the most important plant, I would say, on these sort of sites. It supports a number of the rarer sort of species, if I'll come on to shortly. As well as the grasslands, you get some very nice heathland sites. So these spectacular heathlands, particularly in late July and August, look really spectacular. You particularly get these on those free draining tips that are on top of the valleys, so very high altitude. And another example of one of these heath-covered coal tips, this one at Dare Valley Country Park. Lichen heath is a particularly special habitat associated with these colliery sites. So because competitive plant species like the grasses, these lichens and these mosses to establish, and so these big clumps of white that you can see here are reindeer moss or cladonia lichens. And you can see these form these beautiful carpets. You get quite a diversity of lichens, which I'll come on to later. You get varying wetland habitats as well. So you get anything from ditches, as you can see here. You get boggy sort of conditions. You've got a lot of cotton grass here, so it's indicating quite boggy, damp conditions. You get sort of marshland, so back as well then, and lots of sedges. You do get reed beds as well, and usually these are quite small, but in exceptional circumstances, like at this site, you get a massive reed bed, and this is actually the largest reed bed in the county of Rhondda and Taff. And you can imagine that's what. And one of the most important habitats on these sites is bare ground. So bare ground is a habitat that's been but is really important to these sites and generally within the environment. So this bare ground will provide basking opportunities for things like reptiles, so particularly adders, slowworms, and common lizards, which are really abundant on these tips. But they also provide hunting areas for visual predators, calcareous seepages. So it might be a bit difficult to tell here, but all of this sort of grey stuff here is tufa. So tufa is calcium carbonate that has been deposited. So water rich in calcium is leaching out the side of this tip here, and it's forming this calcium carbonate which has been deposited, which is called tufa. And you get some very special mosses that grow around these tufa springs, and they have some very rare invertebrate species that develop within inside these specialist calcium-loving mosses. And this is a really special, well, sign on these tips, really, because these seepages support some of the rarest invertebrates in the United Kingdom. So the fact that these are very common on coal tips means that these coal tips could turn out to be hugely valuable in terms of the conservation of some rare species in Britain, which is really exciting. But unfortunately, some of these habitats that we've seen, they haven't had an opportunity to develop because a lot of these spoil tips were removed in the 1970s and 80s, so they were what we call reclaimed. So there's a huge emphasis on this during the 80s, and much of that stemmed from the Aberfan disaster of 1966, which some of you will be familiar with. So a lot of these were reclaimed, so they were either removed completely or they were leveled and reshaped, so kind of removing those very steep slopes, grading them down much more shallowly. You get the installation of these drainage channels to keep the water off the tip, because the Aberfan disaster was caused because it was water movement under the tip, so it's trying to stop that slippage. And they were also applied with fertilizer, which was actually just chicken manure, covered in chicken manure and then seeded with grass. And then sometimes they were planted with trees as well, but not always. These reclaimed tips are typically large because they incorporate both the old tips and the actual associated collieries as well. They're very much simpler, so they're not as random as some of those tips we've seen earlier. So they've had that randomness engineered out, so they're less valuable in that sense to biodiversity because we haven't got all those different habitats and those varying conditions, but they are still of value, which is important to note as well. So here's a picture of some piles of chicken manure at what is now Deer Valley Country Park. So during the reclamation process, they smothered all of these former coal tip areas in chicken manure and then seeded them with grass. And these are some of those sort of grasslands now. So you can still see that they're still very valuable, even though they've been reclaimed. So we've got them very nice grassland here at Deer Valley Country Park. You've got another reclaimed grassland here, and the former Cambrian colliery site in Clydach Vale, which is now Clydach Vale Country Park. You can still see a lot of those legumes, so the birds of trefoil and white clover and so forth, but you can see how much level this is, and you haven't got those varying sort of aspects of varied topography. It's very much more uniform. Another sort of very flower-rich and reclaimed site, so you can still see they're very important flower-rich habitats, even though they sort of haven't got that habitat complexity. And here's just some photos showing the reclamation of some of these sites. So we got Tylerstown Tip in Rhondda, which is known locally as Old Smoky. And you've got the father and son, so the bigger tip and the smaller tip on the top there, probably pictured in about the 70s. And then the smaller tip was removed, and the bigger tip had the top cut off it and was seeded in grass seed and probably with chicken manure as well. But in that period since the 1980s to now, a lot of that chicken manure has leached away and probably ended up in Cardiff Bay. The seed mixes have all died off, and eventually a lot of these reclaimed sites will just revert back to how nature intended, which it always puzzled me as to why we still reclaim sort of old brownfield sites, things like quarries and coal tips, when essentially nature will do it for free and do a far better job as well, and it'll always do what nature intended to do. So this is actually the same tip from the southern side, but as you can see, all of that the seed mix and all that has died off, and you start to get heathland coming in and so forth. So a lot of these reclaimed sites can undergo their own sort of biodiversity renaissances later on in life. And they kind of resemble some of the older tips eventually anyway. So coming on to the invertebrates. So back in January 2015, I started my research invertebrates associated with these colliery sites in South Wales. So I was based at the National Museum of Wales doing a traineeship called the Natural Talent Traineeship Scheme, which was run by the conservation volunteers and funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And it was all about getting the next generation of experts coming through, because they realised that invertebrates are getting on a bit and they wanted some new blood coming through. So as part of this traineeship scheme, I focused on researching the invertebrates associated with colliery sites, and thankfully found some very good results, so much so that Rhondda, Can and Taff which is my home county borough, and Neath Talbot, which is an adjacent one, kindly funded me to have a look at some of their sites as well in their county. So I've been looking at these sites for a number of years now. And I've looked at 15 sites across these two counties. So I've looked at these 15 sites, which include a mixture of these old tips that have been left alone and some of these reclaimed tips. And in total, I've recorded 901 species so far across these sites, which isn't a really spectacular figure. Insects and identifying of insects, and I started with no background in entomology at all, so it's been quite a steep learning curve. But it does emphasize that it's quite a diverse invertebrate fauna that exists on these sites. But perhaps most importantly, about 20% of all the invertebrates that I found were of conservation priority. So these are species that are considered localized, scarce or rare, and should be really conserved. So they play a huge part within the conservation, and I'm sure the case will probably be in other coal fields as well. So come on to some of these species now. So starting with the butterflies. So I've recorded 28 butterfly species on coal tips so far, and I'm sure there must be more. So some of the most iconic species are things like the stingy skipper, which is a very harsh name for what is a very beautiful butterfly. So it's a species that's active at the moment now and has been for the last few weeks. It feeds on common birds of trefoil, that yellow plant that I talked about earlier. It's quite a small, rather moth-like butterfly. But importantly, it uses a common plant, but it needs areas of bare ground in order to develop. So it needs the higher temperatures that are provided by bare ground in order for its caterpillars to develop. So it's very much a good indicator of bare ground habitat and early successional habitats. So these do very, very well on these colliery sites here in South Wales. Another species that uses bare ground and is very, very abundant on these sites is the grayling butterfly, which is a priority species, as is the dingy skipper. And this is another one that needs that bare ground. So its caterpillars feed on grasses, but again, they kind of feed on those grasses next to areas of bare ground because you get that higher temperatures for development, which is really important. So when it tucks its forewing with that orange coloration on the eye spot underneath its hind wing is very well camouflaged. So they can be quite hard to spot in that sense, but they're quite large butterflies and they can be very abundant on these sites. So one to keep an eye out for if you have any of these sites near you. And this species will be on the wing, particularly in July and August, but starting this month as well. You get a lot of fritillary butterflies on these sites, which are really beautiful. So things like the small pill-bordered fritillary is one of them, but also the dark green fritillary. So both of these species are active at the moment and feeding on violets in the damper areas associated with these sites. So definitely worth keeping an eye out for these. And in rather exceptional circumstances, you can get the small blue butterfly, which is our smallest resident butterfly within the UK. And it's rare in South Wales, largely associated with coastal dunes, but it started to spread, given the opportunity to some colliery sites where it's feeding on kidney vetch, which is the plant that butterfly is on there. And just the one moth that I'm going to mention is the six-belted clearwing. And this is a species that is active in this month, June, and also July. Feeds on that common birds of trefoil again, so you can see how important that plant is. And it's called six-belted because you've got these 6 yellow bands going down the abdomen there. And you'll see clouds of these flying on sunny, warm days, which are always really nice to see. Touching on bees, so bees are probably the group that's been studied the most on these sites, and that's because that is my area of expertise. So I focus quite a lot on the bees associated with colliery sites. And so far I've recorded 89 species across the sites I looked at, which is quite an impressive figure because it includes about a third of the entire UK bee fauna and about half of the Welsh bee fauna as well. So not bad for a few sites locally to me. And this includes a number of uncommon species, so localized, rare, scarce species. And some of the best colliery sites can support somewhere in the region of 50 to 60 different bee species, but possibly more as well. So you can see how important these are for bees, and as you know a number of our bees are struggling at the moment, so it's very important. And move us on. Rather ironically, most of the bees associated with these sites are mining bees, so there is still mining going on in the South Wales valleys, hence the little bee with a hard hat and a pickaxe there. So we have 28 different mining bee species associated with these sites, but also a lot of other bee species, so things like nomad bees, which are cuckoos that sneak into the nest of mining bees, things like furrow bees, blood bees, yellow-faced bees, leafcutter bees, mason bees, wool-carder bees, and so forth. So a huge diversity. So 73 different solitary bee species, we call them, can be found on these sites. And these sites are also really good for bumblebees. So South Wales is one of the best regions in the UK for bumblebees. And the coal tips, obviously because they're very flower rich, attract quite a lot. So we have 15 bumblebee species can be found on these sites. So 15 of the 24 bumblebee species in the UK. So it's a very, very good total. So if you're really into bees, then these colliery sites are places to go. So where you've got large expanses of bilberry, on these tips, you get some of the bilberry and upland specialists. So you get the bilberry mining bee on the left there, which has just gone over now, I think, will come into the end of its season as the bilberry flowers are finished. And you get the bilberry bumblebee on the right there as well, which I think the bilberry bumblebee is probably one of our most beautiful bumblebee species. It goes bright orange tail that extend most of the way up the abdomen there. So these are very much upland species, so they really like the bilberry-rich coal tips. Where you've got quite a lot of tormendill, which is the smaller little yellow plant, it's pictured here in clumps, you get some very specialist species. So you get the tormendill mining bee on the left there, which is a nationally scarce species and a priority for conservation because it's undergone a very widespread decline. And that only forages on tormendill. And then on the right there, you've got the thick-margined mini mining bee, so one of the mini miners, some very small mining bees. And this is a rare species that again forages on tormendill. And well, essentially most of the Welsh records, recent records, originate from coal tips within the Rhondda valleys. So very nice species to have. And I talked quite a bit about the legume-rich grasslands, so lots of these clovers and vetches and so forth, and these have their associated bees as well. So you get things like the red-backed mining bee on the left there, which is a legume specialist and nationally scarce, and the one on the right there is the brown-banded carder bee, which is another nationally scarce bee species that really likes these legumes. There's also quite interesting wasps on these sites. So this is the red-banded sand wasp, which is quite the big wasp that feeds on caterpillars, particularly of moths. And I was just watching these just the other day, which are really nice to see. And you also get things like spider hunting wasps, which are probably my favorite wasps. So these actively hunt out spiders, and they sting spiders and end up paralyzing them. And then they bury the spider alive with its little wasp grub, and the little wasp grub eats the spider alive, and it's quite a clever thing because by keeping the spider alive, it's keeping the food resource nice and fresh for the little developing spider hunting wasp. But this particular species is a scarcer species, and this is one that's a cuckoo of other spider hunting wasps. So it actually steals spiders, I suppose, off other spider hunting wasps, lays an egg inside them, and then hope that the other spider hunting wasp comes back and takes the spider back to his nest, not knowing that there's already a cuckoo wasp inside the spider. But really fascinating things. Really one standout species is very commonly associated with these colliery sites, and that's the green tiger beetle. So not a rare species, quite widely distributed across the UK, but it likes very dry, free draining conditions, and it likes hot sites as well. So as you can imagine, the black bare ground associated with these spoil tips are absolutely brilliant for these species because it's dry, free draining. They provide hunting areas for the beetles because you can see they've got quite large eyes and big jaws. So they're scuttling around trying to find spiders and ants to hunt. So really good sites to see these. And you can also see their larvae. So their larvae are rather bizarre looking things. So they have quite circular heads, and they sit within these circular burrows. And essentially they wait for things to come along, like spiders and ants, or anything really that happens to fall down, and they'll grab them with their big jaws. And yeah, obviously eat them. But yeah, these are really wacky little things. Another bee that's probably one of my favourites associated with these colliery sites is the bee beetle. Very furry patterning that somewhat resembles a bee. And you'll start seeing these probably this month. I usually see them visiting thistles on these colliery sites, but their larvae develop inside dead wood, particularly a birch, and birch is quite a common tree species really on these colliery sites. And there's a whole myriad of other beetles as well, which I'm not going to go into in any detail, but the top row are all weevils, and the bottom row are all leaf beetles. But as you can see, quite a diversity of species and colours and shapes and sizes and so forth. We can get some really beautiful little beetles and quite a number of nationally scarce species as well. In terms of flies, you'll get some of these big tachinid flies, which are very bristly flies that are internal parasites of a lot of moth species. So this particular species, which is Tachyna grossa, is Europe's largest tachinid fly. So very black with a yellow head, a big, like a sort of queen bumblebee size, so you can't really miss it. And you tend to see these in the sort of bilberry-rich areas of these spoil tips. I get things like snail-killing flies, which are some of my favourite flies. Some of them got these really impressive patterns on wings, and as the name suggests, these actively hunt snails, but they will do slugs as well, and they develop inside or on these mollusks. Soldier flies are another really nice group. So this particular species, which is the banded general, quite a big species of soldier fly. It develops in some of those seepages that I mentioned earlier, and this one will be on the wing in June, so very, very soon. And here's another species of soldier fly. This one, fortunately, I haven't got a picture of a live specimen, but this is the hill soldier, and this is a nationally scarce species associated with those tufa springs, those calcareous seepages I mentioned earlier. You get things like bee flies, so you might be familiar with bee flies if you get them in your garden, but on these colliery sites you get this particular species, which is the western bee fly, which is a nationally scarce species that's on the wing at the moment, very, very small. And you get a lot of ant-associated flies. So ants do particularly well on these colliery sites because they're open and warm, and ants really like open, warm conditions. And you get hoverflies that develop inside the nests of ants. So this particular species, which is microdon, which is a very dumpy hoverfly, this develops inside this doesn't have a common name, but this is Hoplomarcus thunbergi. And you'll see this on mousy ear hawkweed. So you'll get huge amounts of mousy ear hawkweed on these sites because mousy ear hawkweed like very dry conditions. So it's worth keeping an eye out if you see mousy ear hawkweed to look out for this particular species, and the adults will be sitting on top of the flowers. And also the nymphs as well, the juveniles, but they're only about 4 millimeters long, so you have to get your eye in or get close enough to spot them, but very distinctive. Lots of other nice bug species as well, and bugs have probably been the area that's probably, well, yeah, I suppose has kind of introduced the most number of scarce and rare species. So there's been some very nice finds on the colliery sites regards to bugs. So some of these are like the one in the bottom left there, which is Drymus familio, which is a species of ground bug that's long been considered one of the rarest bugs in Western Europe, and that seems to be quite strongly associated with colliery sites in South Wales. But lots of others as well, in sort of varying different sizes and shapes, and a lot of these have been new to South Wales as well, which is really exciting. Just the one grasshopper I'm going to mention, and that's a mottled grasshopper. So these are very vocal, and the adults are out at the moment, and they're very, very screechy. Listen out for this song, but they really like these very dry conditions, and they love the bare ground. So you'll see these out on areas of bare ground, singing away and doing their bit of a courtship, coming in varying different colours, different patterns. But the key to identifying them is the tips of their antennae are thickened, which is hard to tell in this image, but it's more thickened in the males than the females. But so if you can get a good view of these and see the antennae and see this thickened a bit at the top, then I'll suggest it is a mottled grasshopper. We get some very nice dragonflies on these sites. I think about 14 or 15 species. So things like the golden ring dragonfly, which is the UK's longest dragonfly, so the female is particularly long. Very beautiful, unlike these very acidic conditions. You tend to see these in the upland areas, so on the coal tips that are right down the valley tops. You also get things like black darters, which like the very boggy conditions, particularly those high altitude spoil tips. And I believe that's our only resident all black dragonfly. Probably the scarcest dragonfly and damselfly species associated with these sites is the scarce blue-tailed damselfly, and you've got a mating pair here, and these are classified as near threatened and are a priority for conservation. So it's a really nice one to get on these sites. And no talk is complete really without mentioning the Mardi monster. So the Mardi monster is a species of millipede that was found new to science from Mardi colliery in the top of the Rhondda. So this hit headlines well, across the UK and across the world really at the time, which was back in December 2016. And it just goes to show really that these sites can support even species that we don't know even exist within the world. So this is still the only known site in the world for this particular species of millipede, which was found by a friend of mine called Christian Owen. So it shows that really we shouldn't be removing these sites, destroying these sites without really understanding what's on these sites, because lots of other new species could have potentially already been lost, which is quite a sad thing. But of course these sites are important for lots of other things rather than just invertebrates, so particularly vascular plants. Lots and lots of them, which I can come on to shortly. Also lichens, which I touched on a little bit. Also mosses, and they're particularly important for fungi, and quite a lot of work has been done to look at the fungi associated with these sites. Important for amphibians and reptiles, which of course I've already mentioned, and really important for some birds as well. But I'm just going to touch on the vascular plants, the lichens and the fungi, otherwise I'm afraid you'll be here for all day. So some of the plants that I'd like to mention are some of the orchids. So the colliery sites can be really good for orchids, in particular southern marsh orchids and common spotted orchids. These are southern marsh orchids, and you can get quite incredible displays that probably in South Wales only really rival the coastal dunes, places like Cymru. But yeah, these are starting to come out at the moment, despite the dry conditions. Things like the orchids, which I seen my first last week, and these really like the disturbed ground. They can be a bit unpredictable as to where they turn up. But the orchids can be found on these sites. You get things like well, a particular iconic plant really of these colliery sites in South Wales is Pearly Everlasting. So this is a North American species, so it's a non-native species. Some debate as to how it arrived, but probably during the transportation of goods between North America and South Wales during the coal industry. You get large swathes of these in some instances. You can see all of that is all Pearly Everlasting. But quite a pretty plant, and it really likes the dry conditions, but it tends to be more stunted than what you get naturally, or the garden variety. But really cool one. You get things like violets, which I mentioned are important food plant for the fritillary butterflies. So you get these in the damp areas on the spoil tips. One of the more interesting plant species is this wintergreen, roundleaf wintergreen. And this generally is found on coastal dunes, and particularly in South Wales on coastal dunes, but a number of the inland sites are actually colliery sites, so it's managed to spread from the dunes and colonize some of these inland spoil tips. It actually turns out that a lot of these spoil tips actually support dune-associated species, so you can think of these spoil tips as essentially as inland sand dunes, which is quite an interesting thing. Get things like carline thistle, which is really abundant on these sites and is a sign of calcareous conditions. And this is actually the carline thistle when it's flowering, but it actually almost looks like the flower heads are dead. You see a lot of carline thistle. And also lots and lots of lichens. So this is just a phone picture of a little patch of lichens on one of the spoil tips. As you can see, there's a huge diversity of different species just in this little shot here. And these lichens, which are Cladonia lichens, are often really beautiful. The most common of these really are these big clumped ones, so these white clumps of Cladonia portentosa, and it's really, really pretty little lichen, particularly when it's magnified. So we've got these fantastic images from Stephen Murray, a friend of mine, and you can see the intricate details of these Cladonia lichens. And here's another example of another Cladonia lichen, and again, when you sort of magnify up, you can see how stunningly beautiful a lot of these lichens are. And they're thriving on these sites because you've got these open conditions, so you've got a lot of sun and they're not being outcompeted by other things. Another species of Cladonia lichen, and unfortunately I can't go into the details about these because lichens aren't my area of expertise, but they look pretty. Another beauty here. You see the branching on some of these, very nice. And you get things like devil matchstick lichens, so the ones with these little orange-red tops, a bit like matchsticks. And yes, and that's it from the lichens. Touching on the fungi, Emma Williams, who's based in Rhondda has been doing extensive work to look at the fungi associated with colliery sites. And she's found some incredible things, including lots and lots of rare and scarce species and some new to Wales as well. So these are just a few examples. So starting on top row and top left, things like blackening wax caps. You get a lot of wax caps associated with the grasslands of these sites, sometimes well into double figures in terms of the number of species. So they're really important sites for wax caps, but also things like cobalt crust, which is this beautiful cobalt blue coloration on that crust fungus there. You get things like salmon salad fungus, which is one of the rarest fungus that are found on these colliery sites, and Emma's found these on most of the colliery sites that she's looked at. We've got things like lilac firecap in the bottom left, which I think is just absolutely beautiful, especially the coloration. And then you've got things like hair ice, which I believe the fungus causes the wood to excrete moisture, and in cold weather the water freezes as it comes out of the wood, so forming this hair ice, which is really, really cool thing. And you get things like bog beacon, which is another one that's really strongly associated with these colliery sites, particularly in these sort of ditches and in the damper areas. So you get this really diverse fungal fauna, which is including a number of really important species in terms of their conservation. So as you can see, these sites are not just important for invertebrates, they're also important for fungi and for lichens and other things as well. But unfortunately, a lot of these sites are under threat. So it seems to be that regardless of how well nature has reclaimed these sites, there's still a pressure to do something useful with these sites. So that might be putting industrial units on them or putting housing on them or something along those lines. Unfortunately, what should be seen as an ecological asset is still often viewed as a problem in need of fixing. And really, these sites should be given proper consideration during the planning process, which I don't believe currently they do. And why should we really be conserving these sites? So as has been clear, really, they're fantastic wildlife habitats. Unfortunately, they are habitats that are in decline, so there's been a large loss of these spoil tips since the 70s and 80s, and this decline continues even to today. They are a refuge for a number of rare and scarce species that are declining in the wider countryside, particularly elsewhere within the UK. They act as these really important stepping stones in the landscape. So as you can imagine, with all these spoil tips scattered throughout the South Wales valleys, you've got these natural stepping stones to allow species to move through the landscape. And they also fill the gap. So a lot of our more natural habitats would be a lot more fragmented if it wasn't for these colliery spoil sites. So they help to connect up other wildlife habitats as well, which is really important to allow species to move and colonize new areas. But as much as I talk about the biodiversity value of these sites, they also have other values as well. So they're of geological importance, so they provide access to fossils and minerals. They have some archaeological interest. Perhaps one of the most important aspects is their social importance. So they provide really important access for communities, for recreation, which I think is very much undervalued. So they're places for people to go out mountain biking, to go walking, to go horse riding and so forth. They're really important parts of our cultural identity. So a lot of our colliery sites and the actual buildings have been demolished, and some of the only sort of remainders really of that industry that defined Wales really and defined many of our lives have been lost. But these spoil tips remain, and it's nice to keep those family landscape links and helping to tell those landscape stories. Yeah, and I just think they're really important culturally. And they're also important very visually as well, so they're used in regional and local interpretation, coming back to that landscape stories, and quite important within the tourism industry as well. So just to summarise, so these sites support a very diverse invertebrate fauna and other wildlife, and a diversity of habitats. They include some of these species, species and habitats that are considered to be of conservation priority, so they're clearly important sites that should be valued. The old spoil tips, the ones with their varied topography, are of greatest conservation value because you've got that mosaic of habitats. But the reclaimed sites, as we've seen, are still of value and can support some important species. Ironically, these colliery sites now support some of our largest extents of semi-natural habitat within South Wales. So as you can imagine, our more natural habitats, our heathlands and bogs, have been lost to commercial forestry or to development or sheep grazing and so forth. But these spoil tips have become a little refuge for those and the support the natural flora and fauna that has been lost around them. And there's still a huge amount to be learned about these sites. So we've only really scratched the surface on how important these sites are, and I'm sure the more they're investigated, the higher their importance will be recognised. And just basically to sum it up really in one sentence, I think really that these sites deserve recognition, they deserve protection, they deserve management, and they really deserve further investigation as well. I'd just like to give my thanks to various organisations and people. So some of the organisations below and their staff. Particular shout out to Emma Williams, who's been doing a lot of work looking at the cold spoil fungi, and she can be found on Facebook and Twitter, which is @cold-spoil-fungi. Stephen Murray for the use of his lichen images. Caris and Julie have done a lot of work on the Coombe Tips Appreciation Facebook page. In really highlighting the value of one of their local sites in the south of Longborough and Taff, and Christian Owen for his amazing millipede finds. If you'd like some further information, I got a website which is collieryspoilbiodiversity.wordpress.com, which I'd be happy to send out an email to anyone haven't got the time to jot it down. But I've got a document on there called the Invertebrate Conservation Value of Colliery Spoil Habitats, which is not just all about invertebrates. We've got lots of other information about management and the importance of these sites culturally and so forth, which is well worth a read. And it can be found on Facebook and Twitter as well, as can Emma with their cold spoil fungi. There should hopefully be a link to a survey in the chat box. If you can get a chance to fill that out, it should only take a couple of minutes, that'd be really great. So I'd just like to gather some information as to what the public's view is of these sites and gather those evidence really and helping to, well, hopefully conserve these sites as well. So thanks very much for that. So yeah, that's me done. Thanks for having me. And any questions, if we've got the time, then feel free.
So we've got from Phil, are you finding differences in invert diversity with time since reclamation?
Yeah, good question, yeah. So generally, the older the sites, the more species they support as a general rule. So it does vary slightly because every spoil tip and colliery site is unique. So it all depends on what species are nearby in order to colonize that site. So it does vary hugely, but generally the older a site is, the longer it's had time for species to colonize and arrive. But again, it does vary depending on local factors as well.
Okay. The areas of it says of the British and Tallawayne that are
right.
special areas of nature.
Yes, sorry, yeah. So the British is the site within Torfaen. That makes sense now, I get it now. So it's a really important site within the county borough of Torfaen. There are areas within that site that are particularly important. So some of the heath-covered sites around the edge. Off the top of my head, I'll probably have to maybe chat to you in an email or something, because it might be a bit too much to explain in a single chat right now. But yeah, there are certainly areas that are particularly important on that site that need to be properly managed.
Okay, I've got one more question. How can we prevent motocross using the site, and does this particularly damage the wildlife?
Oh, that's a very good and quite controversial question. So these sites are very well used by off-road motorcyclists, some more so than others. In some areas it can be very problematic. So particularly in Mardy Colliery, one of the sites in the Rhondda, is heavily used not just by off-road motorcyclists, but by 4x4s, which do incredible damage, actually, the 4x4s, more so than the scramblers. It can cause movement of tips, which then can become a safety issue, and sort of more likely then that those sites are going to be removed on safety grounds by councils. It's tricky because these sites do create areas, this activity does create areas of bare ground, which is really important, and is kind of resets that succession process again. So within moderation, it can be a good thing, but it does vary on a site-to-site basis, and in some instances it can be very damaging, especially when they drive in through ponds and damaging areas where rare species are found and breed and so forth. So yeah, I wouldn't actively condone the widespread use that everyone should get out and motocross across these sites, but within moderation is okay. But as a general rule, yeah, I think it's a site-by-site basis and probably limit it in most instances.
How successful are efforts to re-establish colliery tip sites, for example, mitigation following a landslip that needs to be removed on safety grounds?
That's a good question, because I don't think anyone's really tried to mitigate for the habitat, because they've never really been valued as a habitat in their own right anyway, so people don't really think about it. So they might destroy a colliery site, but they might not think of, right, we need to recreate a habitat elsewhere. So I don't think there's really a lot of evidence as to how successful that's been, really. But it would be nice to get that evidence, really, if anyone happens to keep monitoring the site maybe that's just been reclaimed, and see how it responds. But yeah, I suppose as long as you're keeping that nutrient level really low and you're not interfering too much, hopefully just leaving it alone will be quite a success in terms of reclamation in the long term, but it might take decades before that comes into fruition.
All right, I've got a couple more sneaking in questions at the end. I love it. We have had similar work being done elsewhere in the UK and Europe, e.g. Belgium.
Oh, has there been any work done? Or there has been work done?
Has there?
Oh, has there? Yeah, there's been a lot of work, particularly in the Czech Republic. So they're kind of leading the way when it comes to colliery sites. So they're a very coal mining dominant region of Europe. So they've been at the forefront, really, of understanding how important these sites are, particularly in terms of reclamation. So they've spent quite a lot of effort into studying the value of sites that are reclaimed in comparison to sites that have been left alone. And they found that sites that have been left alone to colonize naturally and not interfered with support greater diversity of species, most importantly, a greater number of rare and scarce species as well. That's the results that I've been getting as well, because I tend to find more of my rarer species associated with the older spoiled tips that have been left alone. So essentially leaving nature to do its own thing is a good thing in the long run. But yeah, we're way behind, really, in most places, I think.
I think we'll make this the last question, folks, otherwise we'll be here all day. We'll leave him away from his site visits. is how do you think climate change is affecting these sites?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it's one I've been thinking of quite a bit recently because we've had such warm weather. And these spoil tips are very dry and hot in normal conditions without prolonged periods of drought. So I don't quite know how the species that are involved on these sites are going to respond. A lot of them are warmth-loving species, so the fact that the spoil tips are getting warmer might be a good thing for them. I don't know, but the only thing is that the more droughts we get, the quicker the plants are going to die off on these sites. So it could be quite negative in that respect. But I think the value of these sites is going to become more and more important with climate change, because climate change is forcing species to move in order to colonize new habitats. So habitats are becoming unsuitable for some reason, maybe becoming too dry, too hot. So they're using these spoil tips really as stepping stones in the landscape. So it's really important to allow species to move and colonize new areas under a warming climate. These sites, I think, are becoming vastly important and will become more important over time. Is that it? Yeah.
That is it, everyone. Right.
Great stuff.
I'm in the waiting room. I'm a bit late. Right, I think we'll call it quits there. But if you have any other questions, Liam's given us some contact details, but you can also post on the Lost Peatlands site and we can get them to him as well. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right, have a nice day all. I'm going to get out on a spoil tip in Nice Talbot now, so I'm going to go and have some fun.
Brilliant,
thanks Liam.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Liam.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.